Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're taking a pretty wild trip. We're going from dusty, ancient papyri dug out of the desert all the way to the lived, breathing theology that actually shapes how millions of people navigate their own internal struggles. It's all about how nailing down the precise translation of ancient Greek completely shifts how we understand the divine. Okay, let's dive into this.
So here is our roadmap for today. First, translating the New Testament. Second, decoding ancient Greek. Third, the War of Wills. And fourth, the Wesleyan path. It's a really captivating story tying language and faith together. Let's get right to it.
Section 1. Translating the New Testament, Textual Archaeology. You really have to look at these early translators as, well, textual archaeologists. Just look at how this played out. Back in 1886, English-speaking biblical scholars leaned heavily on Thayer's lexicon, and it was a massive achievement. But honestly, it had terrible timing. It was published right before the 1890s, which is exactly when archaeologists started pulling up these massive troves of everyday papyrus documents in Egypt. And suddenly, scholars realized, wait a minute, Biblical Greek wasn't some special isolated language. It was the language of the streets. Those everyday papyri basically made Thayer's work obsolete overnight. That sparked this whole new wave of German lexicons by Pruitt and Bauer, which eventually led to a massive English project in the 1950s by Arndt and Gingrich.
And you really can't overstate the sheer scale of what F.W. Gingrich and William Arndt were pulling off here. At the University of Chicago in the early 50s, they were meticulously adapting Walter Bauer's 4th edition German lexicon, which, by the way, covered literature all the way from 400 BC straight through to Byzantine times into contemporary American English. They were capturing these newly understood ancient words so that the English-speaking world could finally actually grasp their accurate historical context.
Section 2. Decoding Ancient Greek, Papyri Discoveries.
So when scholars actually sat down to decode ancient Greek using these newfound papyri, things changed drastically. Reading Gingrich's 1954 report is literally like reading a linguistic detective story. By cross-referencing biblical texts with everyday grocery lists and legal documents, they uncovered nuances that completely changed how we read the text today. It wasn't just about swapping one word for another. It was about understanding the cultural weight these words actually carried in the markets, the courts, and the homes of the ancient Greco-Roman world.
Here is a brilliant example of exactly what I mean. Take Barabbas from the Gospel of John. Older translations just called him a robber. But through this advanced lexicography, scholars realized the Greek word used for him, listes, carried way more political weight. It actually meant insurrectionist or revolutionary. Think about how much that shifts the entire historical narrative. The crowd wasn't just letting a common thief off the hook, they were actively choosing a political revolutionary over Jesus. Gingrich also points out how the old national name Greek was discovered to actually mean Gentile or heathen in certain passages. Translating these words literally rewrites how we view history.
Section 3. The War of Wills, Flesh versus Spirit.
Okay, so words clearly matter, but how does this shape actual theology? Let's look at the Greek word antikete from Galatians 5:17, where Paul says the flesh desires what is contrary to the spirit. If you look at lexical resources like Strong's and Vine's, this doesn't just mean different. It literally means to lie opposite, to be adverse or repugnant. It paints a picture of direct, face-to-face opposition. The flesh and the spirit aren't just disagreeing, they are engaged as active adversaries.
This is exactly what the 18th century theologian John Wesley picked up on. In his Sermon 48 on self-denial, he outlines this precise conflict. On one side, you've got the natural man's will, which Paul describes as fundamentally hostile to God, and on the other side, the will of God. Wesley pointed out that because these two paths are directly contrary to each other, you simply can't walk both. Walking in one absolutely requires completely quitting the other because, again, they are adversaries.
Which leads us to a pretty profound question. Right? If the human will and the divine will are locked in this face-to-face, repugnant war, how on earth does a believer actually resolve that internal conflict? Do you just try harder?
Well, the Apostle Paul's dramatic solution is in Galatians 2:20, using the word sunisteromai. This means to be crucified with. But here's the kicker. When you look at the foundational Greek, this verb is in the perfect tense. So we aren't talking about some future hope or a daily repetitive attempt. A perfect tense signifies a completed action with a lasting effect. It essentially translates to, I am in a present state of having been crucified. It's about total self-surrender.
We see this pop up again in Philippians 2:7, which describes how Christ made himself nothing or emptied himself. The Greek word there is ikonosin. It means to make empty, to abase, or to lay aside the insignia of majesty. And Wesley took this and applied it directly to the believer. To end this war of wills, a believer has to experience their own ekinosin. You have to empty yourself of your self-rights and self-will to actually make room for God. You simply have to empty the vessel before it can be filled.
And what happens when that vessel is finally empty? Well, Romans 12:2 says, "Be transformed by the renewing of your mind." The Greek word is metamorphoste, which shares a root with morphe. This isn't just a superficial, cosmetic tweak. Lexicons define it as changing inwardly in your fundamental character into a completely new form. That is the ultimate goal here, replacing the world's self-will with the actual mind of Christ. It is a total change of your spiritual DNA.
Section 4. The Wesleyan Path. Practical Holiness.
So, how did these really heavy, ancient Greek concepts become lived, practical doctrines? Well, John Wesley took these academic definitions and turned them into rigorous, everyday instruction. He taught that self-denial is a total resignation to the will of God without any mixture of self-will. He firmly believed that to achieve that fundamental transformation, that morphe we just talked about, a believer has to cultivate what he called a single I, meaning a pure intention focused absolutely on God, cutting out any of that double-mindedness James warns us about.
Now, while John was laying down the technical academic theology, his brother Charles built the lyrical bridge. Just look at this line from one of Charles Wesley's hymns, "I want a principle within of jealous, godly fear." Charles took these intense Greek concepts of inner transformation and active faith, and he translated them into emotional expressions that everyday people could actually sing. He basically gave the theology its heartbeat.
And this brings us to a really beautiful Greek term that's central to Wesleyan theology, energumene. It shows up in James describing powerful prayer, and in Galatians describing faith expressing itself through love. It literally means inwrought or energized action. This right here is the whole foundation of Wesleyan synergism. It's not about just sitting back and being passive. It is the co-working of grace. It's the Holy Spirit and the believer's will working together through a deliberate, energized act of faith.
In modern study curricula, like the Wisdom Seeker's 16-week journey, you can see this theology mapped out sequentially. First, James grounds us in the sovereignty of choice, which is practical holiness. Then Peter introduces hope and the refining fire, which leads straight into John's theology of perfect love. And finally, Jude seals the whole thing with the promise of divine preservation. It is a complete step-by-step roadmap taking you from a surrendered will to true spiritual maturity.
A massive piece of that journey is found in 2 Peter 1:5, which is often called the ladder of grace. Peter tells believers to add to their faith goodness, and to goodness knowledge. And the Greek term he uses for add is epikoregesot. It's a command to lavishly supply. It literally evokes the image of a choir director actively building up a chorus. As a believer, you are commanded to actively, lavishly, and sequentially build up these virtues step by step.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer. We started out with scholars digging everyday papyrus out of the Egyptian sand just to figure out what a word meant, and we ended up with a profound psychological and theological map for inner peace and holiness. So I want to leave you with this to reflect on. How does understanding these ancient precise definitions change your modern perception of your own self-will? When you face trials this week, will you view them as adversaries to be fought, or as opportunities to lavishly supply your faith, empty yourself, and make room for something divine? Think about it. Thanks for learning with me today.